Welcome to the latest pandemic baseball book club interview. We're going to today talk with my good buddy, Brian Wright. His new book is the New York Mets All-Time All-Stars, published by the Lions Press. Like myself, and Brian and I, before I get into that, welcome to the show, Brian. How are you, buddy?
Doing great, Mark. Good to be on with you, and I hope you're doing well.
I am doing well. Brian and I have a long history. We've known each other for a long time. Just get that out there right away. I would not have been able to publish my book had I not met Brian, because Brian was so helpful in the process. And, this isn't about my book, it's about his book. So, but I do want to mention that Brian and I were in the same boat. Our books, as everybody else in the pandemic baseball book club, is that we, wrote these books and they were released during this crazy pandemic. And we banded together to kind of find ways to get our books out there, get our, content out there. Brian, and Brian and I were supposed to do an event together at the Grand Central Library, which I was really looking forward to. Brian was kind enough to invite me along. Now, Brian, what was, when you first realized, because your book came out in March, right? March, your book came out?
It came out late February, like the end of February. It's scheduled to be early March, but close on. Yeah.
So you kind of had a little bit of a head start in the sense that it was around. Everybody knew COVID-19 was a thing, but we didn't know that it would shut down everything for everyone. So what went through your mind when you first heard about what was happening with the, that the pandemic was basically shutting everything down?
Yeah, well, I'll give you some an interesting backstory. So the week in which everything got shut down, I was in Florida, and it just so happens that I got to see the last Mets spring training game, which was March 11th against the Cardinals. Jacob deGrom pitched, I think, 4 innings. And it's interesting. I had no idea that was going to be the last game, because you had heard whispers, and maybe it was because I was on vacation. I wasn't in. Now I was in the epicenter, but I was, in living in Washington D.C. I didn't hear it as much. I just had no idea that was going to be the last baseball game we'd see for the foreseeable future. And when I got word, and I think it was the day before that, I was at Orioles spring training, and that's when we were able to figure out, you and I were able to kind of promote our event together. And I had every reason to believe it was going to happen, despite what was going on. I mean, it sounds silly now, but like at the time I was like, oh, we can, still make it happen, things like that. And I was in Disney World. My girlfriend and I were in Disney World that Thursday, when really everything, it seemed like the entire world was ending, and it seemed like the entire world was shutting down. So it's a weird juxtaposition to be, in the happiest place on earth, while you're taking a look at your phone while you're in line for a ride and going, oh, this is canceled, this is canceled, this is canceled. And that was when it started to hit me, like, oh, I'm probably not going to New York. Opening day may not happen. And that was surreal, because again, for time and place and events, all swirling together, it was very weird to be in Disney World while that was happening. So, at first it's going to sound selfish, but I was like, oh, all these events that I had planned, and I was planning to come up for the week of opening day and go to opening day, and had book events centered around that. Selfishly was just like, oh, why is this happening? I don't want to say why me, but in the grand scheme of things, I very quickly transitioned from, hey, a lot of people having it worse, in terms of book writing. A lot of authors are in the same situation when they can't promote their books, specifically like you and I, having a book centered or specifically tailored to New York. And in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people are just, out of work. So I think you just in this day and age, in this weird time, you just gonna have to make the most of it, be a little creative, maybe reach out on social media, find new ways to try to sell your book, and that's what I'm doing right now.
And what's great about our relationship is that it kind of like dovetails right into the whole Met thing, right? So your book is all about the Mets, and so because you're a huge fan, because you're also someone that does analysis, because you're someone that also does, has been writing about baseball for a long time. What I've always enjoyed about your perspective is that as much of a fan as you are, it doesn't get in the way of your analysis. So when you were putting together your all-time Mets all-stars, what was some of the criteria that you put in place to kind of determine, especially across the eras, right? I know that when I was putting my lists together, I certainly tried to take everything into account, because I'm a storyteller, right? And I know you are too. Like, we'll sit around and we can talk for hours about baseball. So what was the challenge in kind of putting together the lineup across the eras?
There were many factors used in determining who made this team, and I guess that's the beauty of a book or selecting an all-time team is any one person can have their particular criteria or what they emphasize in selecting their team. As far as the all New York team, you can have certain criteria for it, or if you're just selecting a Mets team, you can say, well, I factor these things more than I factor this. For me, I certainly use statistics as one would. I use both traditional and sabermetric. Sabermetric specifically, not only to highlight like someone's defensive ability, but also to kind of balance out the eras. I looked heavily at impact on the franchise and, trying to be a storyteller. I didn't want it to be totally stat based. I wanted it to obviously have, your statistics that lead to someone being on the team. But I wanted to, in terms of telling the story of the history of the Mets, I wanted to find those players that had the biggest impact. So the impact on the franchise weighed heavily. Kind of can you tell the story of the Mets success without talking about this person? That was a big factor. Big game performances, playoff performances. If a player contributed heavily to a championship team, obviously, going back to stats, single season records, Met career records factored in. So longevity wasn't a huge factor. It did mean a little bit. So it was, what I tried to do was to have that balance of a statistical evaluation, but also an eye test, to say like, okay, at this person's peak with the Mets, and I specifically looked at their Mets careers. I wasn't going to evaluate someone outside of the Mets. Would I want this person at their peak to be playing at first base or to be playing at second base or in the outfield or what have you? I tried not to base my team off any quality in particular, but instead make sure to use all those different factors. And if it was a close call, at least one of these factors would determine into who got in and who didn't.
So, like everyone who does this kind of a book, right? There's arguments that you're going to have with yourself, and you're going to, like bounce it off other people, right? You're going to say, hey, for whatever position, what was the hardest argument? What was the toughest decision that if you had maybe there was more than one, what was the toughest, what were the toughest decisions to make, to make the final call on player A, player B, or player C?
Yeah, there were two decisions in particular, and I'm still having arguments with myself. And I guess that might mean I did a good job. I mean, as a fact that I'm still trying to discuss it, and hopefully other people are debating or having their own internal debates as well. But there were two positions in particular that gave me still give me the most angst, and I should probably get over it by now. But one was starting pitcher. So to give a little more background, I made sure to have 10 pitchers, but I expanded it out to 7 starters. not to say I had a 7-man rotation, but I wanted to, because the Mets, if anyone who's followed the Mets knows, they've had a great success with starting pitching, going from Seaver to Kuzman to Gooden and then now up to Jacob deGrom. So I didn't want to kind of limit myself to a starting 4 or starting 5. I wanted to give that kind of leeway or latitude so I could allow a few extra great starting pitchers to make it. That being said, 7 was like still, to determine number 6 and 7 was hard. And I've probably given it away, which I regret, in interviews, and I shouldn't do that. I'm not going to do it now. But the 4 that it came down to for the last 2 pitchers was Ron Darling, Al Leiter, David Cohn, and Sid Fernandez. And I could go, I could look at it. I could try to compare all 4 and say, oh, those 2 should be in and those 2 should be out. Or I could look at it and go, like, I could see it going any way. And people have said, like, oh, I think that person should be in there. And I don't have that much disagreement. I think you can evaluate and determine these players in any real way you can. My final determination was lean more on like impact on the franchise and kind of looking at the particular eras that they pitched in and kind of making my decision that way. Certainly, again, the statistics played a part, but I look more at that impact and influence on the team at the time in which they pitched. The other position that gave me the most angst was backup left fielder. Now, I'll just say right now, Cleon Jones is my starting left fielder and have no problem with that. But backup left fielder was just it. Literally, I had written the manuscript with one person there and then changed it after I completed the first draft. That's how tough it was. And it was between, I'll say this, it was between Michael Conforto and Kevin Mcreynolds. Now, anyone who says, oh, Michael Conforto is a right fielder, I made sure to evaluate these players based on the position they have played with the most. So like Edgardo Alfonso's barely played more games at second base. Therefore, I evaluated him as a second baseman. Michael Conforto still, to this day, has played more games in left field than right field. So that's why I evaluated him there. But that was a very tough decision because if you look at their numbers, and it's interesting because Mcreynolds was pretty consistent. Conforto, I think, gets the bad rap that he's not consistent. So, but if you look at their numbers, it's very similar. And it's also especially tough considering that Michael Conforto is a current player. So how do you factor that? How do you kind of evaluate someone that's, you're kind of putting something in stone, so to speak, but yet, no, we all thought they'd be playing right now. Right. But when I'm writing it, if you put it in stone, you just go, but someone reads this in like June, how is that going to change? So that was just the one that, like, still to this day, I'm like, oh, did I make the right decision there?
Look, we as I wrote in my book, we had these conversations all the time when we were kids, and as we get older, the conversation and the analysis may become more sophisticated. It may become more, based on other things, I've covered the game, you've certainly, covered the game. So that kind of bleeds in as well, our personal interactions with some of these players that we've interviewed and things like that. We might say that we're Vulcans and that it doesn't affect, the end, the end of the game, the end of the day, it might factor in, it might not. So I guess when you were putting this together and you started to talk to players, started to talk to people who had covered the game, other authors, fans, do you think that, or would you say that those folks tended to favor the people that you interviewed, tended to favor the people that they saw play rather than the historical player that was being discussed for that position?
Yeah, I think most definitely, and I think it would be disingenuous for someone like me to say, oh, I can balance out the eras, and because I will just naturally have that bias towards the team like when I was growing up, which is like the late 90s, early 2000s. I kind of remember those particular players better than someone else, from the late 60s or the early 70s. And I think for the most part, and then maybe the entire part, I think I made sure to get rid of that bias. But I think initially you kind of look at it and go, you think one way, and then once you research, you talk to other people, you kind of take those opinions into account. It kind of balances it out and kind of gets it comes through the filter, and you get what I think is your best answer as far as the opinion. But what I think when you talk to players, you talk to writers of a certain era, you talk to fans, and this is something I've noticed like on social media, you can tell that they lean towards a certain era. Nothing wrong with that, because if you're a former player and you played with a guy and you know how important he was to your team, you're going to have those feelings are going to still linger years later. But yeah, as I said with social media, I can see, like, sometimes on social media I'll like post like, hey, who do you think should be, and this is before the book came out, who do you think should be in center field, or who do you think should be in right field, and it's like clockwork. But sometimes it doesn't. You'll see the people who are from a certain generation just love Mookie Wilson, and I love Mookie Wilson too. You can see people of like maybe my age who just favor Beltran, or maybe contrary to that, blame Carlos Beltran for the strike three call, but we're not gonna get into that. And the older generation talk about Tommy Agee, or say, hey, Tommy Agee was the best. So I've noticed that very clearly. It's very interesting to see that it's kind of a good, I don't want to say sociological experiment on top of just a Mets experiment.
What was the player that surprised you the most, that you thought that you knew everything about, because you're a Met fan, so you're like, oh yeah, I know who my team's going to be. Was there any player or any position where you were surprised at the outcome?
So the player I was most surprised, and it's after I just talked about, hey, I'm biased toward players of a certain era. Now I'm going to contradict that. When I started making the team, when I got the contract to write the book, and I knew I was going to be doing this project, I kind of quickly made a makeshift team, or a makeshift 25-man roster, and wrote down players at each position. And at second base, of course, you're going to have Edgar Alfonso. And then I wrote down Daniel Murphy. And I'm like, Daniel Murphy, is he really going to be on the all-time team? I mean, I know what he did in 2015, October 2015 specifically. But is he really going to make the team? And then I look back at it. It's silly, because I was watching like every game that he played. And you kind of forget that before October 2015, which was what, catapulted him to definitely make this all-time team. He was very good, a very consistent hitter. I mean, you could count on him to deliver at least 30 doubles, at least 150 hits. His base running and his fielding notwithstanding, which is very questionable. But even though he wasn't much of a power threat, he was a reliable hitter. Again, when he was healthy, and I think after 2011 he was relatively healthy, and he was an all-star in 2014. So. We all remember Danny Murphy for what he did in those two playoff series in the LDS and LCS specifically. Just basically turning into Babe Ruth and Reggie Jackson combined. But you kind of forget, or at least I did, that he was, still a solid player and at least a borderline candidate to be an all-time team second baseman, even before that, little 2-week, 3-week stretch happened. A guy that I don't want to say I didn't realize how good he was, but I guess maybe I should say that. A very underrated player that I think gets lost, probably because of David Wright, is Howard Johnson, who, if you look at his overall numbers, I think his 89 season, his OPS plus is still the best ever in a single season by a Met. And in terms of power numbers, he's top 5 in a lot of categories. I think he had his best seasons when the Mets were underachieving or declining. I mean, 87 was the afterglow of 86, and the Mets were pretty much a disappointment, not making the playoffs. But Hojo had his breakout year. Then 89, the Mets finished second, or disappointing because they're supposed to win the division. He has another 30-30 year. 91, another 30-30 year, and the Mets free-falled at the end of the season. So I think that kind of obscures him, because if he would have done that in 86 or 88, maybe we would talk about him a little more. So he gets kind of overlooked as well.
You know, it's funny, when you mentioned both of those players, you know, and I remember I'm much older than you. And so, you know, the 80s were, you know, kind of the late 70s and the early 80s is where my fandom began. You know, I have vague recollections of the 73 series, but my first year of baseball really, it's probably 75. That's the year I remember going to games. That's the year that, you know, I really started like the series in 1975, having a rooting interest in that series and watching it. My thing, when I asked that question about eras and, you know, players favoring or people favoring players from their era, I think sometimes, and you kind of just talked about it with players that you watched play, that bias can go the other way, where it's, you know, I don't remember him being that good. I watched the guy's whole career. You know, there are guys that you'll say that about. And I would never question, for instance, Carlos Beltran's statistical achievements as a New York Met. And I'm not one of those blame Beltran for looking at strike three for the reason that they lost that series. I think the series was lost way before then. But I still wish he would have swung the bat. That's neither here or there. I've always, myself as a Met fan, I've always taken to the emotional players, the players that wore their emotions on their sleeves. And that's why it's always, you know, for me, you know, if you told me I could have Mookie Wilson or Carlos Beltran on my team, there's no question Carlos was a better player. But I'm a Mookie guy. You know what I'm saying? I'll fight to the tooth for Mookie, because I saw Mookie as this incredibly special player that maybe never really got to, you know, never got the opportunity to be a Met all-time legend because they gave up on him so quickly, or that he should have been someone that wasn't a platoon player, you know? But again, that is bias. That is someone that you fell in love with. What I'm saying is sometimes when you watch a player on a day-to-day basis, you can also have that opposite, you know, that opposite feeling where, was that player really that good? So it's a good point that you bring up, because I find myself doing that sometimes, because my fandom and my baseball experience is much longer, you know? So like when I filled, like a couple of weeks ago, myself and John Jastrzemski from WFAN, we filled out all-time team ballots, you know, for Major League Baseball, players that we saw play. And, you know, mine has like guys like George Brett and Joe Morgan, and, you know, and his has like Albert Pujols and guys like that, you know, who are, you know, much more like where, you know, you watched baseball. So, you know, then you have the steroid era, then you have all this other stuff that goes into play where, you know, just like the NFL, where the stats mean something completely different now than they did, let's say, in 1940, 1950, 1960. When you thought about, you know, your final lineup, and this is what I'm going to write, and this is the book I'm going to put together, what arguments did you kind of think were going to be like, when you wrote the book, you say, wow, people are really going to bust my chops about this? Was there anyone in particular when you made the lineup that you're like, people are really going to mess with me over this decision?
You know, the one guy, and I haven't, maybe I'm gonna karma will come and get me as far as me saying this, because I haven't gotten any kind of backlash on this, and maybe it speaks to what we just talked about, the having watched a particular player of a certain era and being biased, as opposed to being biased the other way. But I put Robin Ventura as a third baseman, and now I just revealed 3 third basemen, but he's I put him on there, and you know, probably someone will say, you know what, he only played for 3 seasons at the Mets, probably more remembered as a White Sox. You know, why would he be on there? And my argument for that, and again, I haven't gotten people to say that. I've had people say, oh, I'm glad he's on the team. So who, you never know. But my argument for that was, he had, if he wasn't hurt, he would have had 3 fantastic years at the Mets. Got hurt in his last 2. You know, he didn't have great postseason numbers, but he had big hits at the right time. And in '99, at the end of that regular season, had a couple big games and a couple big hits. And the '99 season was spectacular. Won a Gold Glove. You know, I think he had his career high maybe in home runs, if I'm not mistaken. At least over 100 RBIs. But I kind of looked at it as like, hey, you know, if I'm putting together a team, do I want, you know, Ron Ventura or do I want this guy? And that's kind of what it came down to. And right. I think I had I needed one more infielder to fill it out. And I was like, why would I want Ron Ventura out there at third base? You know, maybe in a late game situation if I'm playing a hypothetical game. So that was one I put him out there, and I'm going like, oh, someone's gonna say like, wait, I didn't know he was a Met. Someone younger or older might say, really, he was on the Mets? I mean, even though he's remembered for the Grand Slam single, which is a fantastic moment and the moment that I most remember as a Mets fan, being born in '87. Even though I think it's kind of a, you know, the game was great before he did that. It just made it a unique game and a unique kind of punctuation to it. So that's the one guy I right off the bat thought like, okay, maybe I'll get a little backlash. And I think for left field, and I'm not going to reveal it. And again, if you listen to an old interview, you may be able to hear who I said is on it. But left field, I figured may get you could get one side saying, hey, that was a great choice. You may have another side saying, oh, why would that person be chosen? And then also with pitcher, because with the last couple starting pitchers, because you're going to have people who are saying, wait, whoa, that guy was dominant. You know, he had, this many years. He was unhittable for, these kind of games. Oh, you should put him on there. And again, as I said before, I can't argue against what maybe someone's saying if another person should be on there. All I can say is this is why I'm arguing for these particular people. So and then I look back and I think, maybe I shouldn't have put that guy on there, or maybe I shouldn't have. But at the same time, this is what makes this kind of book and your kind of book so great, because it leads to these conversations. And I think if everyone were to agree with me, it would be a boring book. And I think
right.
Maybe the same goes for yours.
No, I agree. I think that sometimes, because here's the thing. I think this is the struggle, and you could agree with me or not. I think the struggle is, do I take a contrarian view and pick someone that I know is going to be controversial, or do I pick the easy person that's going to be more marketable? And that happened a couple of times, probably about 3 or 4 times during the course of me putting together my book, because I tried to align things. And then I said to myself, you know what? I don't know if I'm ever going to write another book again. And I don't want to have any regrets after I put pen to paper that, oh man, I really wanted to put that guy, but I put somebody else because I thought that would get me a spot on SNY or someone in the Yankee hierarchy is not going to like that I ignored this player. And I felt like, my whole career for myself has always been, I really don't care what anybody else thinks. So Did you find yourself having to make those decisions, or were you more like, no, this is what I'm going to do and that's what I'm going to pick?
I mostly went for, here's what I believe. And if it winds up being a kind of contrarian idea, then so be it. I just kind of went with what I thought. I mean, for the most part, the left field decision was I tossed that around. And I don't want to say I thought about, what will be the kind of get the most reaction. But I mostly thought okay, it did come down to what my feeling or my belief was as far as the selection of that particular player. So mostly it was just, my firm belief, and if it's contrarian, then that's great. And that's, that was the case for, my first book, which was Mets and Tens, which I don't know if you can see it, but it's up there. I never wanted to say like, okay, what will get people to react, or what will get people to, agree with me the most, or what have you. I just wanted to put out my opinions at the time, and I, again, as I said, maybe with pitchers or certain positions, I contradict or I argued even with myself. I look at, at my first book and go like, oh, I think that part of, that top 10 list that I made should be changed. I'm having, 2020 version of Brian Wright is having arguments with 2018 version of Brian Wright. And that's what
Right.
that's what makes it great. So I feel if you just go with what your feeling is at the moment you finally put, as you said, pen to paper, I can kind of feel good with myself in a sense.
Well, look, I love the way you write, and I've always enjoyed talking baseball with you, because I always feel like I'm talking to myself, somebody who is honest about their experiences, honest about how they feel, honest about, look, I love the Mets. I'm not going to, you're wearing a Met jersey for goodness sake. Like, you don't care if people are going to be like, oh, well, you're a Met fan, so that's why you feel the way that you feel. I've always felt, and I said this to you, like when you mentioned Mets and Tens, which I loved. And I love that the fact that when I Google it, our interview for Gotham Baseball Live comes up. But I remember, speaking with you about it back when it came out, and you just didn't care whether you were going to, irritate anyone, because this is the way I feel. Like, just because I'm a Met fan doesn't mean that I'm not going to criticize the Mets for something. It's not like I'm not going to, like there is this, there's so many subcultures when it comes to, the Met fan base. There you have the complete, ultra pin button wearing people who you cannot ever criticize any Met ever for any reason. You have the ones who hate everything. Everything sucks. And then you have, guys like you and me, or people like you and me, who kind of see the forest for the trees, Willie Randolph probably was mistreated when he was the Met manager, and that's unfair, but maybe he wasn't really a good manager, you can have those conversations without, well, you must hate the Mets then, because how could you criticize, Willie Randolph? Or vice versa. How could you say anything nice about Willie Randolph because of A, B, and C? So I think that when I promote your book to other people, I always say, well, Brian Wright is going to write the book the way that he believes it should be written, and he's going to give you the content the way that it should be delivered. So that's why, I get a kick out of your work, because it's not, I could criticize maybe your choice or maybe your justification, but I can't question your integrity and the way that you went about your process. So that's why I appreciate it when you write these kinds of books, because I know that it's coming from your heart and your soul. And that's why, I wish you like this greatest success with this book. Why did you decide to do this special, well, actually, I'll let you explain it, the process that you're doing with some of the proceeds going to a worthy cause. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Mark, for those very kind words. And I must say, I equally appreciate your honesty in your writing, and also your incredibly passionate voice when it comes to talking about the Mets. So I guess we're kindred spirits in that sense. If for anyone who's interested in a copy, especially specifically a signed copy through me, you can reach out to me on Twitter, or which I'm at Brian Wright 86. And if you do and you're interested in a copy, I have been donating a portion of all sales to Hospital for Special Surgery to assist those healthcare workers who we're indebted to many times over, and it's really the least that I can do at this point, considering the circumstances. Before, previously I had donated a portion to the New York City COVID-19. I think it's the Response and Impact Fund. I always get that name confused. I'm trying to get it right. But I donated some of the proceeds, some of the sales to them. And now, I wanted to make sure to at least reach out to the hospital, the healthcare workers who are just, gosh, God bless them. I mean, what they're doing is just remarkable, and I hope we have a parade for them when we're able to. But I wanted to make sure to donate to them as well. So for the foreseeable future, a little bit is going for all sales are going to HSS, which is in the New York City area. And again, the least I could do, but I figured it was a nice little tribute specifically for a book tied to New York that people would kind of react to that and help donate to a great cause. So really, it's, again, the least I could do at this point.
One of the great things one of the great things about having you join the Pandemic Baseball Book Club was that when people should, I wrote about it in my book, but when I was having trouble selling my book, Brian was like, hey, I'll put you in touch with my publisher. That sounds like a great idea. You should hook up with them. And, Joan Ryan, who was another member of our Pandemic Baseball Book Club, she asked a bunch of questions of me and some of the other members about, and it leads to this, is that, so we are so conditioned as content creators, whether it's books, whether it's podcasts, whether it's radio shows, whatever, that, we want to promote ourselves. We want to get ourselves the good book contract. We want to get ourselves the spot on SNY or, whatever. So your selfless act not only allowed me to achieve a dream, but I see it at work in this Pandemic Baseball Book Club, where you have, really accomplished authors with really big publishing houses kind of lending a hand to, I'm not going to put you and I in the same, sentence, because you've actually published 2 books and I've only published 1. But, guys who are lesser known, folks who are lesser known and it's a spectrum, it's like, one of the things I think it's great that you've joined the club and are now a part of it is that you've practiced what you've preached, and you've been one of these members of a community before, and really kind of being, as I said, I'll use the word again, selfless in helping others. And I think it's really admirable and fitting that you're a part of the club. I don't know if I'm that selfless. I'm a little impressed with myself, Brian. And, and sometimes it's hard to share the spotlight and I just try to be honest, and I think that your process and how you have come about, that's why I wish you so much success, because you really are a guy who's a giver. And I think it's really, I appreciate it. And I think it's a perfect fit for the Pandemic Baseball Book Club.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I always say, I try to do things that I kind of, it's going to sound funny, I wish other people would do, because I sometimes, when I was trying to get my first book published, I had wished that I may get an author who has written a couple books to kind of help me out. And it always felt like that was a struggle. And I was very fortunate to get a hold of Arcadia Publishing and the History Press, as you were as well. And they were able to kind of work with me in terms of getting that first manuscript done. And it's hard. I mean, first time author, that's not an easy thing to do to get noticed. And specifically because I was, writing for websites. It was not my full-time job. I have a full-time job in the government, working here in DC, which is, incredibly boring, but it pays the bills, I guess, as my dad would say. But that I was, struggling to get that recognition. And, to be honest, even now I still struggle, or maybe I feel that way. I still struggle to get that recognition. So if someone's gonna, someone needs that assistance, I do that because I'm like, I wish someone would do that for me. Like, I'm like kind of that feeling like, hey, if I was in that position as like and I was in that position as a first time author, I wish someone would say, hey, let me, put you in touch with this person. So that's, that's how I come about it. And for this group to be with this great group of wonderful group of authors, I feel it's a definite plus because you get, connections, you get like, hey, how do you contact that person? And if we're just, trying to compete with each other, which is kind of ridiculous, if you're competing for particular contacts, especially if you have books that are tailored to different audiences, it's rendered meaningless. It's pointless, I guess I should say.
Right.
So, for someone who has a book on the Oakland A's, you're not going to be looking for the same kind of contacts or the same kind of media outlets as if you're doing a book on the Mets or New York baseball in general. So, but that person may know someone who, has a contact at a certain New York media outlet. So it's all for the best. And I think it's great to be working together with this wonderful group of authors.